Without me, she would be useless and homeless. My father smirked in court, adjusting the cuffs of his custom suit. He looked at me with pure disdain, fully expecting me to shatter under the weight of his words. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, my face a mask of absolute calm. The judge, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Judge Vance, adjusted her glasses and carefully read the heavily sealed document my attorney had just handed her. The room was dead silent. She looked up from the pages, her piercing gaze shifting from me to my father and then to his highly paid lawyer. "So they really do not know?" she asked, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. My father's lawyer frowned, visibly confused. "Know what, Your Honor? Actually, she is." Judge Vance began to read the legally binding truth. I watched the blood completely drain from my father's face as the realization hit him. "My name is Zuri. I am 32 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a corporate forensic auditor, I learned to read the truth hidden in numbers escaping their toxicity by building my own success. But sometimes you have to face the very people who broke you. Before I share exactly how I legally dismantled my toxic family's entire empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to use your own success to silence a family who constantly underestimated your worth. The road to that courtroom began exactly 3 weeks earlier at a Sunday dinner I never should have attended. We were gathered at my father's sprawling estate in Buckhead, Atlanta. The grand dining room, with its crystal chandeliers, heavy velvet drapes, and imported marble tables, felt more like a theatrical stage for my parents to perform their wealth than a place for a family to connect. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense and suffocating. We had just buried my Aunt Vivian 2 days prior. Vivian was my father Desmond's older sister, a fiercely independent woman who had always been the black sheep of the family simply because she refused to conform to my father's patriarchal standards. To me, she was the only person who ever recognized my brilliance. She was the one who encouraged me to pursue numbers, to seek out the truth, and to never let anyone dictate my value. My father tapped his crystal wine glass with a heavy silver spoon, demanding absolute silence. He stood at the head of the table, projecting the false humility he always utilized when delivering self-serving news. As the patriarch of this family, he began, his voice booming across the room with practiced authority. "I have taken it upon myself to act as the sole guardian and executor of Vivian's estate. As we all know, she was childless, lived completely alone, and her mental state in her final years was questionable. The family needs to step in to manage her affairs properly and protect her assets from being squandered." I gripped my linen napkin under the table, my knuckles turning white. Aunt Vivian was not mentally unstable. She was sharper than anyone in that room, possessing a business acumen that my father could only dream of. My brother-in-law, Jamal, let out a loud, obnoxious smirk that broke the silence. Jamal was married to my younger sister, Kiara. He was a smooth-talking opportunist who had somehow landed the role of chief financial officer in my father's logistics company despite having bankrupted 3 previous startups. Jamal leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, swirling his bourbon with an air of unearned entitlement. "It is about time someone took over that historic property of hers," Jamal said, a greedy glint in his eye. "The land value alone in that neighborhood is astronomical. We could flip it for a massive profit." Kiara, the golden child of the family, immediately chimed in to support her husband. She tossed her long extensions over her shoulder and pouted at our father, playing the role of the helpless, deserving daughter. "Daddy Jamal and I have been looking for a new luxury property for months. Vivian's house has that gorgeous vintage architecture that everyone is dying for right now. It would be absolutely perfect for our new lifestyle upgrade. We need that space way more than anyone else, especially since we are the ones building the real family legacy." My mother, Patricia, smiled warmly at Kiara, her eyes crinkling with adoration. "Of course," sweetie, Patricia cooed, reaching across the table to pat Kiara's manicured hand. "Vivian would have wanted the house to go to a growing proper family. It is only right that you and Jamal take it over and fill it with life." But hearing them disrespect the only woman who ever loved me unconditionally was my breaking point. I could not sit there and let them rewrite her legacy. I set my fork down with a deliberate clink against my plate. Aunt Vivian never trusted you with a single dime. Dad, I said, my voice steady and cold, cutting through the murmurs of agreement at the table. And she certainly would never want Jamal and Kiara turning her home into a vanity project. The entire table froze. My father's eyes narrowed into a dangerous, piercing glare. The prominent vein in his neck pulsed as he looked at me, outraged that I had dared to challenge his authority in his own home. You count pennies for other people's companies, Zuri, he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You are a glorified calculator. Do not ever think you can speak on real business or real estate in my house. You have no idea how wealth is actually managed or preserved. My mother Patricia jumped in to weaponize her usual brand of family guilt. Zuri, stop being so difficult and bitter. She scolded, her tone patronizing and sharp. Look at yourself. You are 32, single, with no husband and no children. What would you even do with a historic house anyway? You do not need the space. You should be happy to yield to your sister. Kiara needs it for her family. You should be supporting her, not acting out of jealousy and spite just because your own personal life is empty. The disrespect hung heavily in the air of the dining room. For years they had used my independence and my deliberate choice to focus on my career as a weapon against me. They viewed my lack of a husband as a fundamental failure, ignoring the fact that I had built a successful, lucrative life entirely on my own merits. Jamal chuckled under his breath, clearly enjoying the spectacle of my public humiliation. Kiara shot me a triumphant, pitying look, silently telling me that I had lost yet another battle for our parents' approval. In the past, I would have argued passionately. I would have raised my voice desperately, trying to defend my worth, trying to make them see my value and respect my intellect. But as a forensic auditor, I had learned a valuable lesson early in my career. Arguing with arrogant, entitled people is a complete waste of energy. The numbers always tell the real story, and the truth requires no defense. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not offer a single word of justification for my life choices. I simply stood up, pushed my chair in, and picked up my handbag. If that is how you all feel, I said quietly, projecting a chilling calm that I knew would unnerve them, there is no need for me to stay for dessert. I walked out of the dining room with my head held high, refusing to look back. Ignoring my mother's dramatic sighs about my bad attitude and my father's muttered insults about my disrespect, I had spent many long, exhausting years analyzing complex corporate financial ledgers and relentlessly tracing hidden fraud. It was a skill requiring patience and an eye for details. My toxic family viewed my highly meticulous nature as a fatal flaw, a sign that I lacked the bold spirit making my father a legendary businessman. They were finally about to learn that true power always comes from having the undeniable facts. The email from Mr. Sterling contained a massive, heavily encrypted attachment that would completely change my entire life. As I read the summary, all the broken puzzle pieces of my family's hidden history locked into perfect place. The sudden silence was a sharp contrast to the noise I had escaped. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and took a deep breath. Just as I shifted into gear, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was an email from Mr. Sterling. The subject read, "Urgent, the Genesis Trust." I opened it. Reading the lines, a smile spread across my face. They had no idea what was coming. A few short days passed since that disastrous Sunday dinner. The humid Atlanta air pressed against the stained glass windows of Aunt Vivian's historic Victorian home. I stood in the center of the parlor, surrounded by her meticulously curated memories. Vintage vinyl records and bookshelves filled with novels covered every surface. I spent the morning categorizing belongings, breathing the familiar scent of lavender. The house offered a rare sanctuary from the noise of my parents. That fragile piece shattered instantly. The heavy oak front door flew open with a violent crash, slamming against the entryway table. Jamal strode into the parlor wearing a tailored linen suit that looked entirely too tight, projecting an arrogant swagger. Right behind him was Kiara, clutching a designer handbag and wrinkling her nose in disgust at the dust. Trailing behind them were two burly men carrying heavy toolboxes, locksmiths. I stood my ground, smoothing down the front of my slacks, and watched the circus parade into my aunt's sacred space. Kiara crossed her arms and glared at me, her lips pulled back into a triumphant sneer. Jamal did not even bother offering a greeting. He simply marched right up to me and thrust a crumpled piece of paper directly into my face. "This is an official notice of temporary guardianship," Jamal announced, his voice booming with unearned authority. "Your father went to the courthouse this morning. The judge agreed that Vivian's estate needs immediate competent management. The court granted Desmond full emergency control over this property to prevent any unauthorized tampering. You have exactly 24 hours to pack up your trash and get out of our house." The sheer audacity of his statement hung heavily in the dusty air. I did not need to read the document to know it was a complete sham. Desmond had undoubtedly called in a favor with one of his corrupt golfing buddies on the local bench, leveraging his status in the business community to push through a temporary order without any proper legal review. He thought a piece of paper signed by a shady judge would be enough to intimidate me into packing my bags and surrendering. Kiara walked over to the fireplace, running her fingers along the hand-carved mantelpiece. "I want all this junk cleared out by tomorrow afternoon," Kiara complained, aggressively wiping dust off her hand. "The contractors are coming on Friday to measure the living room for the open concept floor plan. Jamal and I need to finalize the demolition schedule. I want a modern marble aesthetic, not this old depressing museum vibe." The locksmiths shifted uncomfortably near the doorway, clearly realizing they had walked into the middle of a toxic family war. One of them looked at the floor, refusing to meet my eye. Jamal snapped his fingers at the men, pointing toward the heavy front door. "Go ahead and change the deadbolts," Jamal ordered them. "Make sure you give all the new keys directly to me. She will not be needing access after tomorrow." I looked from the fake legal document in Jamal's hand to Kiara's smug face. They really thought they had won. They truly believed they had outmaneuvered me with a rushed piece of paper and a couple of hired workers. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot exactly what I did for a living. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or beg them to respect the woman who had lived and died in this house. Emotional outbursts were exactly what they wanted. They fed on chaos and pain. Instead, I slowly looked Jamal up and down, engaging the cold, analytical mindset that made me one of the most feared corporate forensic auditors in the state. I stepped closer to him, closing the physical distance until he was forced to look down into my eyes. My gaze dropped deliberately to his left wrist. "That is a stunning watch, Jamal," I noted, keeping my voice conversational and dangerously calm. "A Rolex Daytona yellow gold with a green dial. Retail value is roughly $38,000, but given the current secondary market scarcity, you likely paid closer to $50,000. Jamal puffed out his chest, clearly pleased that I had noticed his flashy new accessory. He adjusted his cuff to show it off more prominently. "It takes real business acumen to afford the finer things, Zuri. Something you would know nothing about." I smiled, a small, razor-sharp curving of my lips. "You bought it last Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon from a boutique in Buckhead," I stated, watching his smug expression falter slightly. "And you did not use your own money. You swiped Desmond's corporate platinum credit card, the account ending in 4081, logging the purchase under a dummy vendor expense category, labeled as Logistics Fleet Maintenance." The silence in the room became absolute. The locksmiths stopped moving their tools. Kiara lowered her phone, her brow furrowing in confusion as she looked from me to her husband. Jamal's jaw clenched, a tiny bead of sweat suddenly forming at his temple. "How do you know about that account?" Jamal demanded, his voice losing all its previous bravado. I ignored his question and continued my verbal autopsy. "You call yourself a chief financial officer, Jamal, but we both know that title is a joke. You bankrupted your first 3 tech startups because you could not balance a simple ledger. Desmond only hired you because Kiara cried and begged him to give you a job so you would not look like a total failure at church. And now you are bleeding my father's transportation company dry. You have been funneling massive amounts of corporate revenue into offshore accounts to cover your horrible gambling debts and bad crypto investments. You are a parasite wearing a stolen suit." Kiara stepped forward, her voice shrill and panicked. "Jamal, what is she talking about? Tell her to shut up. Make her leave right now." Jamal could not look at his wife. His eyes were locked on me, burning with a frantic, cornered desperation. He knew I had him completely figured out. He knew I held the power to destroy his entire fraudulent life with a single phone call to the IRS. The profound humiliation of being meticulously dismantled in front of his wife and two blue-collar strangers was too much for Jamal's fragile ego to handle. His breathing grew heavy and ragged. The illusion of his wealth and power had been stripped away in a matter of seconds, exposing the incompetent fraud hiding underneath. He crumpled the fake guardianship document in his fist and threw it onto the floor. "Shut your mouth!" Jamal roared, his face twisting into an ugly mask of rage. He lunged forward, closing the space between us in a single aggressive stride. He raised his hand, aiming to grab me by the collar, fully intending to use physical intimidation to regain the control he had just lost. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not even blink. I stood perfectly still, maintaining my icy composure, and simply raised my right hand. I pointed a single, perfectly manicured finger up toward the top corner of the room, right where the crown molding met the ceiling. "Look up, Jamal," I commanded, my voice dropping to a whisper. Jamal froze mid-lunge. His hand hovered mere inches from my shoulder. He slowly turned his head, following the direction of my finger. Nestled discreetly in the shadows of the molding was a small, sleek security camera. A solid red light blinked steadily, indicating that every single second of his aggressive outburst had been recorded in high-definition, crystal-clear audio and video. "I installed a full security perimeter at 6 o'clock this morning," I informed him, crossing my arms over my chest. "The footage uploads directly to a secure encrypted cloud server. If your hand makes contact with me, I will have the Atlanta Police Department dragging you out of here in handcuffs for assault, and those corporate credit card receipts will be handed straight to the district attorney before you even make bail." Jamal's face turned an ashen shade of gray. He slowly lowered his arms, stepping backward, as if the floor had suddenly caught fire. The two locksmiths exchanged a nervous glance, immediately picked up their toolboxes, and walked straight out the front door, wanting absolutely no part of a criminal investigation. Jamal swallowed hard, his chest heaving as he grabbed Kiara by the arm. "We are coming back tomorrow with the sheriff." Jamal spat out, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "You cannot hide in here forever." I stood and watched them practically run out of the old house. I calmly walked over to the heavy oak door, pushed it shut, and locked the deadbolt, ready and waiting for whatever game my family wanted to play next. I had barely pulled my hand away from the heavy brass deadbolt when the sharp ringing of my cell phone shattered the quiet of the entryway. I glanced down at the screen resting on the mahogany console table. The caller ID displayed a glamorous, highly filtered photo of my mother, Patricia, smiling perfectly for the camera at some country club gala. I stood in the silent hallway and let the phone ring 3 times, taking a moment to analyze my own physical reaction. My heartbeat was completely steady, my breathing was even. The days of her unexpected phone calls inducing tight-chested panic were entirely behind me. I swiped the green button and lifted the phone to my ear, offering nothing but silence to the woman on the other end of the line. "Zuri," my mother began, her voice dripping with that specific sugary disappointment she reserved for moments of intense manipulation. "I am sitting here in the sunroom with Pastor Davis. We just finished bowing our heads, and he is deeply concerned for your spirit. We are both actively praying for your greedy soul." I leaned against the entryway wall and stared at the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight. She did not ask if I was physically unharmed. She did not express a single ounce of concern that her son-in-law had just lunged at me in a fit of violent, unhinged rage. Instead, she immediately deployed the weapon she knew best. She used the culture of the church to gaslight me, cloaking her toxic demands in the holy language of faith and salvation. "Jamal just called us." My mother continued, her tone shifting from pious to deeply scolding. "He was incredibly shaken up by your hostile behavior today. You humiliated him in front of those contractors, Zuri. You brought shame to this family by acting like a street thug. Pastor Davis agrees that this obsession you have with material things is leading you down a very dark path. You are stepping away from the light. You need to remember your place and honor the family hierarchy." It was a masterclass in psychological projection. She was accusing me of the exact greed and materialism that fueled her and my father. As a corporate auditor, I was trained to strip away emotional language and look strictly at the underlying transaction. My mother was trying to execute a hostile takeover of my boundaries using spiritual guilt as her primary leverage. Your father is willing to overlook this massive tantrum of yours, she said, her voice softening into a fake maternal coo, offering me the illusion of an olive branch. He is a gracious, forgiving man, Zuri. We want to put this ugly mess behind us. Just give Kiara the keys to the house. Let your sister have the property she rightfully deserves. If you do that, your father will write you a $5,000 check for your troubles. You can use it to buy yourself a nice vacation. We are family, Zuri. Stop being difficult and do the right thing. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, dissecting the sheer absurdity of her offer. Aunt Vivian's historic Victorian estate was situated on 2 acres of prime Atlanta real estate. The market value was easily upwards of $3 million. And my mother, acting as the mouthpiece for my father's fragile empire, was offering me a measly $5,000 bribe wrapped in religious guilt to walk away from my inheritance. They truly believed I was that stupid. They genuinely thought I was so desperate for their basic approval that I would trade a fortune for a tiny check and a fake smile. $5,000. I finally spoke, my voice devoid of any emotion, echoing coldly in the empty hallway. You are attempting to buy out a multi-million-dollar estate with a check that barely covers one of Kiara's designer handbags. You can tell Pastor Davis to save his prayers for Jamal, because he is going to need a lot of divine intervention when the federal authorities review his accounting ledgers. Zuri, do not you dare speak to me with that tone, she snapped, the sweet facade instantly vanishing, replaced by harsh, jagged anger. You will respect your father, and you will respect me. You lost my respect the moment you sent a thief to assault me in my aunt's home, I replied smoothly, cutting through her escalating rage. Keep your $5,000, mother. You are going to need it to pay your son-in-law's legal fees. I am hanging up now and I am blocking this number. Before she could utter another toxic word, I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button. I navigated straight to her contact profile and pressed block. I felt a profound, beautiful sense of release wash over me as the digital tie was severed. The emotional static of my family was finally silenced, leaving me alone in the comforting quiet of Aunt Vivian's house. The silence pushed me to act. I walked away from the front door and moved deeper into the house, stepping into Vivian's grand study. The room smelled of old paper-polished leather and dried lavender. I sat down on the tufted velvet armchair behind her massive oak desk and unlocked my phone, opening the highly confidential email I had received earlier from Mr. Sterling, her private attorney. The email contained a wealth of legal documents confirming my status as the sole executor, but it was the brief, cryptic note typed at the very bottom of the message that held my absolute attention. It was a message written directly from Aunt Vivian, intended for my eyes only. My brilliant auditor, the note read. When the noise of the family finally stops, look to the architect of our bloodline. The numbers never lie, but people do. The truth is locked behind the date Desmond first learned how to lie on paper. I stared at the screen, my mind shifting into a state of hyper-focus. The architect of our bloodline. I stood up and walked out of the study, making my way down the long corridor toward the formal dining room. Hanging on the wall, commanding the entire space, was a massive, heavy oil portrait of our great-grandfather, Elias. He was the original patriarch, the true architect of the family name. I approached the painting, examining the heavy gilded frame. I reached out, gripping the ornate carved wood, and gave it a firm pull. The portrait swung outward smoothly on hidden, well-oiled hinges. Behind the canvas set, flush into the vintage floral wallpaper, was a sleek, modern steel wall safe. It featured a digital biometric keypad and a small LCD screen, waiting for a numeric code. I smiled at my aunt's brilliant paranoia. Now came the true test. The date Desmond first learned how to lie on paper. My mind raced back through the thousands of financial files I had reviewed in my career. I thought about the holding company documents, the offshore accounts, and the hidden ledgers. Then the pieces clicked into place with satisfying clarity. My father loved to boast about his self-made status, claiming he built his logistics empire from the ground up exactly 30 years ago. But the documents Mr. Sterling had sent me revealed the absolute truth. Desmond's original company had faced massive catastrophic bankruptcy. Aunt Vivian had bailed him out quietly, buying his debt and restructuring his entire existence into a subsidiary. The date Desmond first learned how to lie on paper was not the date he started his company. It was the exact date he filed his very first set of fraudulent bankruptcy papers to hide his massive failures from the government the same day Vivian officially purchased his debt to save him from federal prison. I pulled up the attachments on my phone, scanning the digitized historical records Mr. Sterling had provided. I found the original filing document from the federal bankruptcy court. October 14th, 1992. I stepped up to the keypad. I pressed the digits firmly, the electronic beeps echoing sharply in the quiet dining room. 1014924. The small LCD screen flashed a brilliant green. A heavy mechanical clunk vibrated from inside the wall, and the thick steel door popped open a fraction of an inch. I reached out and pulled the heavy door wide open. Inside the safe, there were no stacks of $100 bills. There were no velvet boxes filled with diamonds or antique family jewels. There was only one item sitting alone on the cold steel shelf. It was a thick, heavy leather binder, dark mahogany in color, with pages bursting from its seams. I carefully reached into the safe and pulled the heavy binder out, resting it on the polished surface of the dining room table. I ran my fingers over the cover. Stamped directly into the worn leather and faded elegant gold foil were three words that would seal my family's ultimate downfall: the Genesis Trust. I flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was a master index of corporate ownership printed on thick, watermarked legal paper. As a forensic auditor, I did not just see text on a page. I saw power. I saw absolute, unyielding leverage. I pulled up a chair, turned on the brass reading lamp, and began to read the numbers that would systematically dismantle my father's entire false reality. I carefully lifted the fragile, aged pages from the heavy leather binder and spread them across the polished mahogany of the dining room table. The brass reading lamp cast a warm, golden pool of light over the documents, illuminating decades of hidden history. As a corporate forensic auditor, I do not look at financial spreadsheets as mere collections of ink and paper. I view them as a living, breathing language. Numbers never lie. They possess an honesty that arrogant people like my father try to bury. I arranged the files chronologically across the table, letting the deeply buried financial narrative of my family take shape before my eyes. My father had spent my entire adult life cultivating the grand myth of the self-made titan. He stood at exclusive country club galas and local church pulpits, loudly proclaiming how he built his massive logistics empire from the ground up through sheer willpower, unmatched intellect, and ruthless business acumen. He constantly demanded profound respect, forcing everyone around him to bow to his fabricated greatness. But the stark documents spread across the wooden table painted a vastly different, dark, deeply humiliating picture. I slowly traced my index finger down a faded corporate ledger distinctly dated October of 1992. This was the exact historical period my father always confidently claimed was his golden era of magnificent expansion. According to his deeply beloved personal mythology, this was the specific year he brilliantly secured his first major fleet of commercial trucks and completely dominated the regional shipping routes throughout the Southeast. The hard numbers told a violently different truth. Desmond's logistics empire was definitely not expanding in the fall of 1992. It was suffocating under its very own massive, unsustainable weight. I meticulously reviewed a very long series of desperate commercial loan applications, deeply leveraged corporate collateral agreements, and highly aggressive notices of default from three completely separate commercial banking institutions. Desmond had foolishly overextended his operations to a truly catastrophic degree. He had arrogantly purchased a fleet of expensive transport trucks he absolutely could not afford, hastily leased massive warehouse space far beyond his actual operational capacity, and blindly signed devastatingly bad vendor contracts, carrying predatory, borderline illegal interest rates. His daily operational cash flow was almost entirely non-existent. He was almost exactly 30 days away from complete, irreversible federal bankruptcy. The official documents clearly showed the initial legal filings, the desperate, pathetic plea to the federal courts to restructure his massive, unpayable commercial debts. He was about to quickly lose the transport trucks, the storage warehouses, the very large family home, and every single ounce of his highly precious social standing. He was standing directly on the precipice of being permanently exposed as an absolute financial fraud to the entire elite business community of Atlanta. Then I finally found the critical transfer documents. Aunt Vivian had decisively stepped in, but she definitely did not just sit down and write her very foolish little brother a blank check. She did not politely offer him a blind financial bailout or a sympathetic interest-free family loan to save his deeply bruised ego. Aunt Vivian was a corporate mastermind. She knew exactly who Desmond truly was deep down. She fully knew his blinding arrogance would instantly burn through any liquid cash she simply handed over to him. So she calmly executed a flawless, ruthless, and highly strategic corporate maneuver. Vivian bought his debt. I carefully read through the dense commercial purchase agreements, my profound respect for my late aunt multiplying rapidly with every single turned page. She had quietly approached his primary commercial creditors and aggressively purchased his many defaulted loans for mere pennies on the dollar, completely removing the hostile banking institutions from the equation entirely. She legally assumed all of his disastrous financial liabilities, permanently absorbing the entirety of his failing logistics company directly into her own rapidly expanding private financial portfolio. She miraculously saved him from federal bankruptcy court and public humiliation. The sheer magnitude of this stunning revelation sent a massive shockwave of pure adrenaline pumping through my entire system. My father's entire grand identity was a meticulously manufactured illusion. His overwhelming arrogance, his daily condescension, his loud demands for absolute obedience from his compliant wife and exhausted children were all precariously built on a fragile foundation of Vivian's silent, controlling charity. He had foolishly spent 3 long decades proudly walking around the Atlanta city like an untouchable giant, completely ignoring the absolute fact that his older sister actually owned the very ground he walked on. I continued quickly turning the aged pages smoothly moving from the historical accounting ledgers of the early 90s directly into the much more complex, highly structured corporate governance documents of the modern era. If aggressively buying his massive debt was Vivian's first true genius move, what she strategically did next was a brilliant masterclass in ultimate financial control. I opened the very final section of the incredibly thick leather binder, where the most recent and highly sensitive legal filings were meticulously organized. Aunt Vivian had actively and brilliantly weaponized the debt to fully protect the remaining family assets from Desmond's very relentless incompetence. I deeply studied the highly complex corporate mapping she had perfectly established in the late 90s. To the oblivious outside world, and even to the countless oblivious employees who worked there every day, my father's massive logistics company seemingly operated as a totally independent, highly successful corporate entity. Desmond proudly held the prestigious title of Chief Executive Officer. His name was boldly plastered on the side of the main building. His flowing signature was printed on the weekly employee paychecks. However, the very closely guarded Genesis Trust documents clearly revealed the brilliant, completely invisible legal cage Vivian had permanently constructed around him. Vivian had quietly and efficiently set up a massive holding company legally registered and protected in the Cayman Islands. This powerful offshore entity offered her absolute privacy and completely bulletproof financial asset protection. She then decisively executed a totally silent, flawlessly planned corporate restructuring. Desmond's entire domestic logistics business, every single transport truck, Every regional warehouse lease, every corporate bank account, and every very valuable trademark was completely rolled up and permanently absorbed. The Atlanta-based logistics company instantly became nothing more than a minor wholly owned subsidiary of the Cayman Islands Holding Company. I read the dense operating agreements twice to absolutely ensure my tired eyes were not deceiving me. The strictly drafted legal language was absolute binding and entirely impenetrable. Desmond did not own a single share of the valuable company he proudly paraded around town every day. He possessed zero equity. He had absolutely zero voting rights on the board. He was, in the strictest possible legal definition, a glorified, highly paid employee of his older sister. Vivian had allowed him to keep the prestigious title of CEO purely for public appearances, letting him play the role of the big boss to protect his fragile ego. I eagerly turned to the final, thickest legal document secured in the back of the binder. It was the absolute, irrevocable, and ironclad succession plan for the entire Genesis Trust. Aunt Vivian had fully known her health was rapidly failing. She knew exactly how Desmond, Patricia, Kiara, and Jamal would selfishly behave the absolute second she passed away. She had brilliantly anticipated every single desperate move of their greedy, highly predictable playbook. I traced her black signature. The total ownership of the holding company transferred irrevocably to a single beneficiary. My name was printed across the parchment. Zuri. I was the newly appointed sole executor of the Genesis Trust. I personally owned the very massive fleet of transport trucks. I legally owned the extremely regional storage warehouses. I owned the highly lucrative offshore banking accounts. I was the absolute owner of the exact corporate credit line that arrogant Jamal had just foolishly used to purchase his shiny new luxury watch. The power dynamic of my toxic family had just violently and permanently shifted. For 32 years, my mother had constantly treated me like a deeply disappointing burden. My father had endlessly belittled my career, treating my highly specialized profession as a trivial hobby, while falsely elevating his own fraudulent business to truly legendary status. My highly spoiled sister had cruelly mocked my independence, and her greedy husband had practically tried to physically assault me in this very house, completely confident that I was weak and entirely unprotected. They genuinely thought they could easily, suddenly force me into silent submission with a fake rushed guardianship paper and a loud, deeply intimidating voice. They truly believed I was just a bitter, lonely single woman counting pennies who could be easily bullied out of her rightful inheritance. I slowly closed the very heavy leather cover of the Genesis Trust binder. The warm brass reading lamp reflected brightly off the gold foil lettering. I was not just a simple corporate forensic auditor anymore. I was now the truly supreme chairman of the board. The heavy brass knocker on the front door clanged violently, echoing through the quiet, dusty hallway of the Victorian estate. The sharp sound pulled me instantly from the intoxicating rush of my discovery. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, my hand resting on the smooth leather cover of the Genesis Trust binder. My heart pounded slightly, not from fear, but from the raw adrenaline of finally knowing the truth. My family was relentless, but I did not expect them to return this quickly. I carefully placed the thick binder back into the hidden wall safe, entering the biometric code to secure it. I swung the heavy oil portrait of our great-grandfather back into its original position, ensuring the heavy gilded frame sat perfectly flush against the floral wallpaper. I smoothed the front of my blazer, took a steadying breath, and walked down the long corridor. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open. It was not Jamal returning with the local sheriff. A young, nervous-looking man stood on the porch holding a thick manila envelope. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit, sweating profusely in the afternoon heat. He kept checking his phone, clearly eager to flee the property. "Are you Zuri Washington?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly as he looked up. I nodded, maintaining my cold, professional posture. "Yes, I am." He quickly thrust the envelope into my hands, stepped backward off the porch, and muttered, "You have been served." He practically ran back to his idling vehicle, leaving me standing alone in the humid Atlanta afternoon. I closed the door, locked it securely, and walked back into the parlor. I tore open the seal of the manila envelope and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. The thick black header at the very top of the first page read, "Emergency Petition for Guardianship and Asset Freeze." The officially listed plaintiff was my father, Desmond Washington. I walked over to Aunt Vivian's antique reading chair, sat down, and began reading the legal filing with the exact same forensic scrutiny I applied to complex corporate tax ledgers. The sheer audacity of the claims printed on those pages was genuinely breathtaking. My father was not just challenging my right to remain in Vivian's house. He was attempting to completely obliterate my legal autonomy. The lawsuit formally alleged that I was mentally incompetent and suffering from severe untreated emotional delusions. Desmond's highly paid lawyers had crafted a vicious, entirely fabricated narrative, claiming that I was an estranged, deeply unstable daughter who had violently broken into a deceased woman's property in a desperate attempt to steal her valuable assets. They painted my quiet departure from Sunday dinner as an erratic, terrifying mental breakdown. They completely twisted Jamal's aggressive physical ambush, stating instead that I had violently threatened Kiara and Jamal when they arrived to peacefully secure the property. But the most devastating part of the lawsuit was not the cruel character assassination. It was the targeted financial attack. Desmond had successfully filed a temporary injunction demanding a total immediate freeze on all of my personal bank accounts. I flipped to the attached judicial order, my eyes scanning the harsh legal jargon. He claimed that because I was allegedly experiencing a severe psychotic break, I posed a massive danger to my own financial well-being and the absolute integrity of Vivian's estate. Therefore, the court had granted an emergency hold on my personal savings, my checking accounts, and my independent investment portfolios until a formal competency hearing could be held. My father was executing a classic ruthless corporate starvation tactic against his own flesh and blood. He knew I prided myself heavily on my financial independence. He knew I had spent years meticulously saving every single dollar from my demanding career as a corporate auditor. By freezing my personal assets, he was deliberately cutting off my oxygen. He wanted me completely broke, unable to hire a competent defense attorney, and totally unable to pay my own basic living expenses. He wanted me utterly desperate, terrified, and starving, so that I would have absolutely no choice but to crawl back to his sprawling Buckhead estate, get on my knees, and beg for his unearned mercy. I set the thick stack of legal documents down on the glass coffee table. A slow, chilling realization washed over me. Desmond did not just want Vivian's house. He wanted to completely break my spirit. He wanted to publicly humiliate me in a court of law, strip away my hard-earned independence, and legally brand me as a crazy, bitter spinster who needed her powerful father to rescue her from her own pathetic life. He was treating me like a hostile corporate takeover target, using his vast wealth and corrupt legal connections to completely suffocate my resources. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I opened my mobile banking application and quickly typed in my secure password. The screen loaded, displaying my main checking and high-yield savings accounts. Large, bold red letters flashed across the top of my digital dashboard. Account frozen. Contact your branch administrator immediately. He had actually done it. Done. The brutal injunction was already active. My diversified stock portfolios and savings were entirely inaccessible. I had zero access to the money I had worked 12-hour days to earn. My father had effectively declared absolute unforgiving war. I immediately dialed the direct private number for Mr. Sterling, Aunt Vivian's highly respected corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring, his tone sharp and alert. I told him I needed to see him immediately. Within an hour, I was sitting across from him in his expansive glass-walled office in downtown Atlanta. The immaculate room offered a commanding view of the city skyline, a stark reminder of the massive corporate empires operating below us. I slid the thick manila envelope across his polished mahogany desk. Mr. Sterling put on his wire-rimmed reading glasses and spent several long minutes silently reviewing the emergency injunction. His usually stoic face tightened with visible disgust as he read the fabricated claims regarding my mental health. "Desmond is playing an extremely dangerous, dirty game," Mr. Sterling finally said, setting the papers down and taking off his glasses. He paid a premium to fast-track this emergency hearing. By freezing your personal accounts, he is trying to drain your ability to mount a proper legal defense. He wants to force a quick, entirely favorable settlement before you can even hire counsel. He assumes you are completely vulnerable. I leaned back in the plush leather guest chair, crossing my legs perfectly at the ankle. I am not vulnerable, Mr. Sterling. I found the Genesis Trust binder inside the hidden safe. I know absolutely everything. I know Vivian bought his debt. I know the logistics company is merely a subsidiary of the holding company, and I know I am the newly appointed sole executor of that exact trust. A rare, genuine smile spread across the seasoned attorney's face. Your aunt always said you were the only one in the family with a real brain. Vivian anticipated Desmond would launch a massive legal strike the second she passed away. She specifically structured the trust to remain entirely hidden until the absolute perfect moment. However, Mr. Sterling leaned forward, clasping his hands tightly together on the desk. We still have to navigate this immediate lawsuit. Desmond is publicly dragging your reputation through the mud. He is leveraging his social standing at the country club and his influence in the local church to brand you as an unstable, jealous daughter. Legal battles like this can get incredibly ugly and highly publicized. We can reveal the trust documents now and force him to drop the suit immediately. We can settle this quietly behind closed doors to save the family name and avoid a massive public scandal. I looked down at the legal documents sitting on the desk. I thought about the sheer cruelty of my father freezing my personal bank accounts, attempting to steal the money I had earned through countless sleepless nights and grueling audits. I thought about my mother weaponizing her religion to guilt me into submission. I thought about Jamal raising his hand to me in Vivian's house, and Kiara demanding to tear down Vivian's legacy for a trendy living room. They did not care about saving the family name. They only cared about feeding their insatiable greed. I looked directly into Mr. Sterling's eyes, offering a chilling, utterly remorseless response. Let him sue. Hand him the rope, and let him tie his own noose. Mr. Sterling's eyebrows raised slightly, a clear look of profound professional respect washing over his features. You want to let him take this all the way to a public courtroom? Absolutely, I replied, my voice hard and unwavering. If we reveal the Genesis Trust right now, Desmond will simply retreat, spin a new web of lies, and play the victim. He will claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding. He will use my mother to cry and beg for family unity. I want him fully committed to his own destruction. I want him to stand in a court of law, under the penalty of federal perjury, and swear that he is the sole owner of that logistics empire. I want him to present his fraudulent claims in front of a judge. I want to watch him lock himself inside a legal trap that he can never escape. Mr. Sterling nodded slowly, a fierce, calculating energy settling over the room. We will need to prepare meticulously. Desmond's lawyers will come out swinging. They will try to paint you as a bitter spinster who is completely detached from reality. They will subpoena your records and attempt to tear your character to shreds. Let them try, I said calmly, standing up from the leather chair. I am a corporate forensic auditor. I destroy false narratives for a living. We are going to let Desmond walk into that courtroom believing he is an untouchable king. And then we are going to legally execute his entire empire. We will spend the next week preparing for the ultimate financial slaughter. I walked out of Mr. Sterling's office with absolute clarity. The humid Atlanta air hit me, but I felt nothing but ice-cold determination. The following morning, the highly coordinated assault began exactly as Mr. Sterling had predicted. It did not start with formal legal filings, heavily worded attorney letters, or official court summons. It started in the digital arena, where truth was entirely subjective and optics were everything. My phone screen lit up with an absolute barrage of notifications, text messages from distant cousins, frantic alerts from old high school acquaintances, and direct links to a video that was rapidly gaining massive traction across every local social media platform. I opened the primary link and watched the performance of a lifetime. Kiara sat in the center of her impeccably decorated living room, bathed in soft, forgiving, natural light. She wore an oversized cashmere sweater, looking deliberately fragile, small, and exhausted. Her makeup was expertly applied to mimic the raw, vulnerable appearance of someone who had been crying violently all night. She spoke directly to the camera, with a perfectly engineered trembling voice, painting a horrific, completely fabricated picture of a loving family under siege. My older sister has completely lost her grip on reality. Kiara whispered to her thousands of followers, pausing perfectly to wipe a single carefully orchestrated tear from her cheek. We are a young family, just trying to build a future, and Zuri is actively trying to throw us out on the street. She has become violently jealous of my marriage, my baby, and my happiness. We went to Aunt Vivian's house to peacefully secure the property, and she completely snapped. She threatened us. She is trying to steal everything my father worked so hard to build. Please pray for her mind. We just want the sister we used to know back. The video was a viral masterpiece of toxic manipulation. Kiara had strategically tagged local Atlanta community pages and church groups to ensure maximum local exposure. The comments section was an absolute cesspool of manufactured outrage directed entirely at me. Strangers from across the state were calling me a bitter, lonely spinster, a cruel monster, and a deeply disturbed woman who desperately needed to be locked inside a psychiatric ward. Kiara had successfully weaponized the internet using her polished influencer aesthetic to rally an angry, unthinking mob. She wanted to publicly shame me into a terrified, hasty surrender. While Kiara commanded the digital front, Desmond and Patricia executed a highly coordinated ground campaign, targeting the wealthy Atlanta elite. Their strategy was designed to systematically isolate me from every single social and professional connection I had ever made in the city. At the exclusive Buckhead Country Club, my father held court in the men's grill. He sat with his powerful golfing buddies, sipping expensive scotch and shaking his head with profound theatrical sorrow. He played the role of the heartbroken, tragic patriarch with absolute perfection. We tried everything to get her the psychological help she desperately needs. Desmond told the table of wealthy executives, his voice thick with fake paternal grief. But her mind is simply gone. She has developed these terrifying delusions about our family business. It is a tragedy to watch your own flesh and blood deteriorate so violently. I am just trying to protect her from herself before she destroys Vivian's legacy. His wealthy friends nodded in solemn agreement, offering him their unwavering support and promising to freeze me out of their respective corporate networks. My father was ensuring that if I tried to secure a new auditing job anywhere in the state, I would be blacklisted immediately. Patricia took their toxic campaign directly to the sanctuary of our childhood church. That Sunday, she sat in the front pew next to Desmond, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, as Pastor Davis delivered a fiery, pointed sermon about the destructive sins of greed, jealousy, and family betrayal. The entire congregation knew exactly who the sermon was about. The whispers echoed through the vaulted ceilings, spreading the manufactured gossip that Zuri Washington had lost her mind and viciously turned on her loving parents. They wanted me to feel utterly surrounded, hated, and desperately alone. They expected me to break. They anticipated a frantic, emotional reaction. They waited eagerly for me to post angry, defensive rants online or show up at their house screaming, which they would immediately use as absolute proof of my alleged mental instability. I gave them absolutely nothing. I remained entirely silent. I did not post a single defense on social media. I did not return a single frantic text message from gossiping relatives. I deactivated my online profiles, muted my notifications, and completely vanished from the public eye. I allowed them to shout their fabricated lies into the void. While they aggressively waged a loud, flashy war of public perception, I retreated into the one arena where noise and gossip held absolutely zero power. I went to the numbers. Sitting at the large dining room table in Aunt Vivian's quiet house, I opened my secure laptop. As the newly appointed sole executor of the Genesis Trust, I held absolute, uncontested legal authority over the massive Cayman Islands holding company. I bypassed Desmond entirely and reached out directly to the offshore corporate management firm that Vivian had quietly employed to oversee the trust structure. I securely transmitted the verified legal documents provided by Mr. Sterling, officially establishing my immediate identity as the supreme chairman of the board. The offshore managers were incredibly efficient. Within 2 hours, they granted me elite master-level administrative access to the central servers of the Atlanta Logistics Company. Desmond and Jamal believed their internal financial servers were highly secure, completely unaware that the offshore parent company possessed backdoor access to every single domestic ledger email and transaction. I initiated a silent, ruthless, and deeply comprehensive forensic audit of my father's entire logistics empire. I bypassed the shiny fabricated quarterly reports that Jamal proudly presented to the local business community and dug straight into the raw, unfiltered data. I engaged the cold, analytical mindset that made me exceptional at my job. I was a predator hunting in my natural habitat, and Jamal was bleeding a massive trail of digital evidence directly into my hands. I started by tracing the highly suspicious corporate credit card purchase Jamal had made at the Buckhead Watch Boutique. That single, arrogant transaction was merely the very tip of a massive, rotting iceberg. I followed the digital money trail downward, uncovering a financial crime scene so brazen it was almost insulting. Jamal was the chief financial officer, but his accounting methods were sloppy, reckless, and driven by pure, unfiltered greed. He had established 3 separate shell companies, registered under incredibly vague consulting titles, operating out of empty strip malls in neighboring states. Over the past 24 months, Jamal had been systematically generating hundreds of fake vendor invoices for fleet maintenance, warehouse security, and logistical consulting that never actually occurred. I easily located the primary fraudulent billing ledgers saved on his server. I downloaded the primary financial routing documents, specifically saving the files to my encrypted drive. I carefully reviewed the raw data, cross-referencing a file named A1_9.docx against a secondary dummy invoice log, saved as A2_9.docx. The numbers matched perfectly, revealing exactly how he authorized massive payments from the logistics company directly to these ghost vendors. The money would sit in the shell accounts for exactly 3 days before being swiftly wired into various offshore gambling syndicates and highly volatile cryptocurrency exchanges. I meticulously documented every single fraudulent wire transfer. I matched the fake invoices against the non-existent service records. Jamal had successfully embezzled nearly $2 million from the company, completely draining their cash reserves to fund his secret, catastrophic gambling addiction. To ensure I had an ironclad record of his offshore accounts, I pulled his direct email attachments, legally preserving a highly incriminating ledger named A3_9.docs alongside his encrypted cryptocurrency wallet seed phrases saved under A4_9.docs. The evidence was irrefutable. But the sheer incompetence did not stop with my brother-in-law. As I pulled the domestic tax records, I discovered exactly how Desmond was facilitating this massive fraud. My father was so blindingly arrogant and so completely unbothered by actual operational oversight that he blindly signed off on every single fraudulent expense report Jamal placed on his desk. Desmond was utilizing these massive fake business losses to aggressively, artificially lower his corporate tax bracket, actively committing federal tax evasion while simultaneously allowing his son-in-law to bleed the company dry. They were a pair of arrogant fools speeding directly toward a federal prison sentence, completely oblivious to the fact that I was now sitting in the driver's seat. I spent 4 straight days and nights compiling the damning evidence. I created an impenetrable digital fortress of financial spreadsheets, annotated bank transfers, and highly illegal tax filings. I organized the data into a pristine, devastatingly clear presentation. The lawsuit they had filed against me claimed I was mentally incompetent. They had publicly declared I was incapable of managing my own basic finances. I smiled in the quiet glow of my laptop screen, sipping a cup of black coffee. I had just successfully completed a multi-million-dollar corporate forensic audit entirely in secret, securing the exact criminal evidence required to put the chief executive officer and the chief financial officer behind federal bars for the next 20 years. The trap was perfectly flawlessly set. I closed my laptop, finally ready to let Desmond walk straight into the courtroom. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse swung open, admitting a rush of humid morning air before snapping shut against the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the hallway. I walked alongside Mr. Sterling, our footsteps echoing with quiet, measured precision against the polished marble floor. I wore a tailored slate gray suit, my hair pulled back into a severe immaculate bun. I did not look like a woman on the verge of a mental breakdown. I looked exactly like what I was, a predator walking into a highly anticipated slaughter. We took our seats at the defense table inside courtroom 4B. The space was wrapped in dark mahogany panels and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. I folded my hands perfectly in front of me and waited. The quiet of the room shattered 10 minutes later. Desmond made his grand entrance. He did not walk into the courtroom. He paraded into it, treating the judicial space like the VIP lounge of his exclusive country club. He wore a custom midnight blue suit with a silk tie exuding the absolute unearned confidence of a king arriving to collect his guaranteed tribute. He was flanked by two high-priced, slick-looking attorneys carrying expensive leather briefcases. Trailing right behind him was the rest of the circus. Patricia wore a conservative dove gray dress, clutching a silver cross necklace as if she were a grieving widow rather than a greedy vulture. Kiara marched in wearing a beige designer outfit chosen explicitly to project the wholesome, innocent image of a young mother under siege. Jamal brought up the rear, his eyes darting nervously around the room, though he still managed to jut out his chin in a pathetic display of borrowed arrogance. They moved to the plaintiff's table in a loud, disruptive cluster. Desmond clapped his lead attorney on the shoulder and let out a booming, arrogant laugh that carried across the entire courtroom. Patricia leaned over to whisper something in Kiara's ear, prompting my sister to giggle softly while shooting a venomous, triumphant glare in my direction. Jamal adjusted his cuffs, making sure his newly purchased luxury watch caught the overhead fluorescent lights. They completely deliberately ignored my existence. They did not offer a nod, a greeting, or even a fleeting glance of basic human acknowledgement. In their minds, I was already a defeated, broken woman. I was merely a minor speed bump on their glorious highway to unearned millions. I watched their loud, disrespectful performance with absolute ice-cold detachment. Mr. Sterling sat beside me, completely unfazed by their theatrical intimidation tactics. He casually reviewed a single folder of documents, radiating the quiet, lethal energy of a veteran attorney who knew exactly what was about to happen. A sharp, loud knock snapped the courtroom to attention. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the Honorable Judge Vance entered the room. The entire atmosphere of the space shifted instantly. Judge Vance was a striking, no-nonsense African-American woman with a reputation that preceded her. She was universally known throughout the Atlanta legal community as a brilliant, fiercely intelligent jurist who possessed absolutely zero tolerance for wealthy entitlement or courtroom theatrics. She took her seat at the elevated bench, adjusting her black robe with a sharp, efficient movement. Her dark, piercing eyes swept across the courtroom, immediately locking onto Desmond's loud entourage. She did not look amused. Her gaze dropped to the thick stack of emergency filings on her desk, and the quiet authority she projected instantly silenced my father's arrogant laughter. Desmond straightened his tie, suddenly realizing he was not at the country club anymore. Counsel Judge Vance spoke, her voice ringing out with crystal-clear authority. "I have reviewed the emergency petitions filed by the plaintiff. We are here today to determine the immediate competency of the defendant and to rule on the continuation of the asset freeze currently in place. I expect this proceeding to remain strictly factual and entirely professional. I will not tolerate any emotional grandstanding in my courtroom. Are we completely understood?" "Yes, Your Honor." Desmond's lead attorney, a slick, silver-haired man named Brentwood, replied smoothly. Mr. Sterling simply nodded. "Let us proceed," Judge Vance commanded. "Mr. Brentwood, the floor is yours." Attorney Brentwood stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, highly dramatic flair. He stepped out from behind the plaintiff's table and walked slowly toward the center of the room, positioning himself perfectly so he could address the judge while occasionally casting sorrowful, pitying glances in my direction. "Your Honor." Brentwood began, his voice dropping into a smooth, deeply theatrical tone of manufactured grief. "We are gathered here today, facing a profound family tragedy. Desmond Washington is a highly respected self-made pillar of the Atlanta business community. He is a loving father, a devoted husband, and a man who has spent his entire life building a legacy of hard work and unyielding integrity. But today he is a heartbroken man. He is a father forced into the agonizing position of protecting his family from his own deeply disturbed daughter. Brentwood paused, letting the heavy silence linger for maximum dramatic effect. He turned and pointed a single perfectly manicured finger directly at me. Zuri Washington is a woman lost in a dangerous, bitter delusion. My client is not acting out of malice today. He is acting out of desperate, necessary protection. For years, Zuri has isolated herself from the loving embrace of her family. She lives a solitary, exceptionally lonely life. She has no husband to ground her. She has no children to care for. She lacks the foundational family structure that brings stability and purpose to a person's life. While her younger sister Kiara has beautifully blossomed into a devoted wife and a loving mother, Zuri has allowed herself to become entirely consumed by dark, festering jealousy. I kept my face completely blank, refusing to offer Brentwood the emotional reaction he so desperately craved. He was weaponizing my independence. He was using my single status and my deliberate choice not to have children as absolute proof of a severe psychological defect. To men like Desmond and Brentwood, a woman without a husband was inherently suspicious, unhinged, and dangerously unmoored from reality. Brentwood paced slowly in front of the judge's bench, his voice rising with practiced indignation. Lacking any real personal achievements of her own, and failing to secure any meaningful advancement in her mundane, low-level accounting job, Zuri has latched onto the estate of her late aunt with terrifying, unhinged desperation. She has convinced herself through sheer, untreated paranoia that she is somehow entitled to a massive fortune that clearly belongs to the entire family unit. When my client, the rightful patriarch, simply attempted to secure the property for the benefit of his young grandchild, Zuri snapped. She became violently hostile. She verbally abused her own mother. She threatened her brother-in-law Jamal, a highly respected chief financial officer, with completely fabricated delusional accusations of financial impropriety. Brentwood shook his head, placing a hand over his heart in a sickening display of fake empathy. Your Honor, a woman in her right mind does not lock herself inside a deceased relative's home and threaten her loving family. A sane, competent professional does not invent wild, paranoid fantasies about the people who have supported her for decades. Zuri Washington is experiencing a severe, catastrophic break from reality. She poses a massive immediate threat not only to the very valuable assets of Vivian Washington's estate, but to her own basic well-being. She is completely unfit to manage her own finances, let alone serve in any capacity regarding a multi-million-dollar property. The lawyer walked back over to Desmond, placing a comforting hand on my father's shoulder. We are asking this court to permanently extend the freeze on Zuri Washington's personal banking accounts to prevent her from dangerously squandering her own savings during this psychotic episode. Furthermore, we demand that Desmond Washington be immediately and permanently granted full, uncontested control over Vivian Washington's entire estate, ensuring that the family legacy is protected by a competent, highly successful business leader rather than a deeply bitter, isolated woman acting out of pure, unadulterated spite. Brentwood concluded his vicious character assassination and took his seat looking incredibly pleased with his performance. I slowly turned my head and looked directly across the aisle. Desmond was leaning back in his heavy wooden chair, a wide, deeply arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He looked at me with absolute unfiltered contempt. He truly believed he had just legally destroyed me. He thought his expensive lawyer had successfully painted me into a corner that I could never escape. He thought he was the smartest, most powerful man in the room. I looked away from his smug face and glanced down at the single, slim file folder sitting quietly in front of Mr. Sterling. Desmond had no idea that the noose was already securely tied around his neck. I was just waiting for the judge to let me pull the lever. Judge Vance shifted her gaze from the plaintiff's table to us. The heavy silence in courtroom 4B felt electric. Brentwood, sensing that his theatrical performance had not completely secured the immediate rubber-stamped ruling he expected, decided to push his luck. He stepped back up to the podium, adjusting his silk tie with a flourish of absolute arrogance. He wanted to deliver the final crushing blow. He wanted to give Desmond the exact soundbite my father had undoubtedly paid him thousands of dollars an hour to say on the public record. "Your Honor," Brentwood continued, his voice dripping with weaponized pity, "we are simply asking the court to protect this deeply troubled woman from her own catastrophic decisions." Desmond Washington built an empire with his bare hands. He has provided everything for this family. He has offered his eldest daughter a lucrative position within his company, which she arrogantly rejected. He has offered her financial assistance, which she threw back in his face. Without the incredible, unyielding grace of Desmond Washington, his daughter would be completely homeless and useless to society. She is a danger to the very estate she is attempting to steal. We ask that the injunction be made permanent immediately. There it was, the exact phrase my father had used to threaten me during my college years, the same toxic rhetoric he deployed whenever he wanted to force me into submission. Homeless and useless without his grace. I heard Kiara let out a small, highly audible gasp of mock sympathy from the gallery. Jamal crossed his arms, puffing out his chest, while my mother stared at me with cold, unforgiving judgment. They were all participating in the grand illusion, fully expecting me to shatter under the immense pressure of public humiliation. Judge Vance did not react to the emotional plea. Her face remained carved from stone. She looked directly at my attorney. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice cutting through the thick courtroom air like a freshly sharpened blade. "Does the defense have a response to these extreme allegations? Are you prepared to offer evidence regarding your client's mental competency and her legal right to the assets in question?" Mr. Sterling stood up slowly. He did not rush. He did not match Brentwood's loud theatrical energy. He buttoned his suit jacket with a precise, methodical movement, projecting the lethal calm of a man who held a royal flush. "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Sterling replied, his voice smooth, polite, and entirely devoid of emotional inflection. "The defense has a comprehensive response. However, we will not be engaging with the plaintiff's highly imaginative, entirely fabricated character assassination of my client. We are not here to debate family dynamics or psychological theories. We are here to discuss corporate ownership, legal succession, and verifiable financial records." Desmond scoffed loudly from his seat, rolling his eyes at his lawyer. Brentwood mirrored the arrogant gesture, shaking his head as if Mr. Sterling were speaking absolute nonsense. Mr. Sterling reached down to our table. He bypassed the slim decoy file folder entirely. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, bright red folder. The vibrant color stood out sharply against the dark mahogany of the courtroom furniture. It was the exact color of a massive, unavoidable stop sign. "Your Honor," Mr. Sterling continued, stepping out from behind our desk. "The plaintiff has filed an emergency injunction based on the premise that he is the rightful patriarch of the Washington family, the sole creator of Washington Logistics, and the primary injured party in a dispute over Vivian Washington's estate. We have prepared a highly detailed, legally verified brief that directly addresses the foundational ownership of the assets in question. I believe the court will find the documentation quite illuminating regarding who actually owns the properties, the bank accounts, and the corporate entities Mr. Washington is attempting to control." Mr. Sterling walked confidently toward the center of the room. He handed the thick red folder directly to the bailiff. The bailiff, a tall, imposing man in a crisp uniform, took the vibrant folder and carried it up the wooden steps to the judge's bench. He placed it carefully right in front of Judge Vance. "I ask that the court review the contents of this folder before making any ruling on the plaintiff's emergency injunction or my client's mental competency," Mr. Sterling said smoothly. He then turned, offered a polite, incredibly brief nod to Desmond's deeply confused legal team, and calmly walked back to his seat beside me. The trap was locked. Judge Vance looked down at the bright red folder sitting on her desk. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. Desmond shifted in his heavy wooden chair, a brief, fleeting shadow of annoyance crossing his previously smug features. He was a man who commanded rooms, dictated terms, and expected judges to bow to his massive wealth and social standing. The fact that Judge Vance was actually taking the time to review the defense's submission clearly irritated his profound sense of entitlement. Judge Vance opened the red folder. The room was so quiet I could hear the sharp rustle of the thick, watermarked paper as she turned the very first page. She began to read. Her dark, piercing eyes scanned the top document. It was the certified, legally authenticated master index of the Genesis Trust. I watched her micro-expressions intensely. Judge Vance was a brilliant legal mind with decades of experience dealing with complex corporate litigation. She instantly recognized the offshore holding company structure, the Cayman Islands registration, and the precise, ironclad legal language Vivian had used to completely absorb Desmond's failing logistics business 30 years ago. She turned to the second page. The silence in courtroom 4B became absolute and suffocating. The second page contained the unarguable, notarized succession plan. It named Zuri Washington as the sole executor of the Genesis Trust, the absolute owner of the holding company, and the ultimate legal authority over every single subsidiary, including the very logistics empire my father falsely claimed as his own. Judge Vance's eyes darted back and forth across the text, absorbing the massive, undeniable truth. I watched the realization dawn on her features. The absurd emergency injunction Desmond had filed to freeze my assets was completely backward. The man attempting to seize control of the estate did not even own his own company. He was merely an employee of the woman he was currently trying to declare mentally incompetent. She turned to the third page. This page contained the executive summary of my rapid, ruthless forensic audit. It highlighted Jamal's highly illegal offshore shell companies, the millions of dollars in fabricated vendor invoices, and Desmond's signature explicitly authorizing the massive fraudulent tax write-offs. Desmond let out a loud, highly dramatic sigh, attempting to signal to the court that this was all a massive waste of his highly valuable time. Brentwood leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, preparing to launch into another aggressive verbal assault the exact second the judge finished skimming what he assumed was a desperate, meaningless pile of fake documents. Judge Vance slowly turned the final page. She closed the bright red folder and placed her hands flat on top of it. She slowly reached up and lowered her reading glasses, letting them rest gently on the bridge of her nose. She looked directly across the courtroom. Her sharp, utterly unforgiving gaze locked onto Desmond and his slick, high-priced attorney. Counselor Judge Vance spoke. Her voice was no longer just authoritative. It was chillingly calm, carrying the heavy, lethal weight of an impending execution. Brentwood instantly stood up, buttoning his jacket with a confident smile. Yes, Your Honor. I assume the defense has presented you with a pile of fabricated nonsense intended to confuse the core issue of my client's absolute right to protect his family. Judge Vance stared at him for 3 long, agonizing seconds. She did not blink. Counselor, she asked, her tone dropping the temperature of the entire room to absolute freezing. Are you aware of who currently holds the majority shares of your client's corporation? Brentwood stopped moving. His confident smile completely evaporated, replaced by a look of profound, staggering confusion. He blinked rapidly, glancing down at his legal pad, before looking back up at the bench. I am sorry, Your Honor. My client, Desmond Washington, is the founder, CEO, and sole owner of Washington Logistics. He holds 100% of the shares. That is a matter of public record. Judge Vance tapped her index finger against the bright red folder. I highly suggest you review your public records more thoroughly, Mr. Brentwood, because according to these fully authenticated, internationally registered trust documents, your client does not own a single share of Washington Logistics. He holds 0 equity. His company is a wholly owned subsidiary of a Cayman Islands holding company known as the Genesis Trust. A collective, highly audible gasp rippled through the gallery. Kiara grabbed her mother's arm. Jamal physically recoiled, sinking deep into his chair. Desmond's jaw dropped. The rich, healthy color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen shade of gray. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning pure white as he stared at the judge in utter, paralyzing shock. And furthermore, Judge Vance continued, her voice echoing loudly in the completely silent room. According to the legally binding succession documents executed by the late Vivian Washington, the sole executor and 100% beneficiary of the Genesis Trust is the defendant sitting across the aisle from you. Zuri Washington is the legal owner of your client's entire corporate empire. The absolute crushing reality of the trap slammed into Desmond with the force of a speeding freight train. He was not the king, he was not the untouchable patriarch. He was just an employee, and he had just attempted to sue his absolute boss. Desmond opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The air in courtroom 4B had grown incredibly thin. Judge Vance did not afford him a single moment to recover. She picked up the bright red folder, adjusted her reading glasses, and began reading the contents directly into the official court record. Her voice was steady, resonant, and completely devoid of mercy. "Let the record reflect." Judge Vance stated, her words carrying the heavy weight of absolute finality, that 32 years ago, Vivian Washington systematically purchased the distressed commercial debt of Washington Logistics. Upon acquiring the entirety of this debt, she legally restructured the enterprise. Washington Logistics ceased to exist as an independent entity and was fully absorbed as a wholly owned subsidiary of the Genesis Trust, a Cayman Islands holding company. Every single word struck Desmond like a physical blow. He sank lower into his heavy wooden chair, the arrogant posture he had maintained for decades, dissolving into pure, unadulterated panic. Patricia gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white, her carefully constructed facade of the grieving matriarch completely abandoned. Kiara and Jamal stared at the judge in terrified silence, the rich color rapidly draining from their faces. Furthermore, Judge Vance continued, flipping to the next authenticated page. The trust documents stipulate that Vivian Washington retained absolute 100% voting rights and executive control over the Genesis Trust until the exact moment of her passing. Upon her death, those rights, assets, and corporate titles did not revert to Desmond Washington. They transferred immediately and irrevocably to her designated sole beneficiary. Judge Vance looked up, her gaze locking onto Desmond's pale, sweating face. She delivered the ultimate legal strike with surgical precision. That beneficiary is Zuri Washington. She does not just own her late aunt's estate, she owns your trucks. She owns your warehouses. She owns your lucrative vendor contracts. She owns the leather chair you sit in at your corporate office. You are not a chief executive officer protecting his family empire from an unstable relative. You are a subsidiary employee attempting to file a fraudulent injunction against the chairman of your board. Attorney Brentwood looked like he was going to be physically sick. He had staked his considerable professional reputation on Desmond's lies. He had stood in front of a highly respected judge and viciously attacked the mental competency of the woman who held the actual keys to the kingdom. He quickly shuffled his expensive legal papers, desperately trying to formulate a defense for a catastrophic disaster he had never anticipated. "Your Honor, my client was completely unaware of this structural arrangement." Brentwood stammered, his voice lacking any of its previous theatrical thunder. "There must be some mistake or a secondary agreement regarding the operational control of Washington Logistics." "There is no mistake," Counselor Judge Vance replied sharply. "The documents are internationally authenticated, fully notarized, and legally impenetrable. Your client has operated under a profound delusion of ownership. He has utilized this court's valuable time to file an emergency petition based entirely on fabricated financial authority. The temporary asset freeze placed on Zuri Washington's personal accounts is lifted immediately. The petition for guardianship is denied with extreme prejudice." Desmond sat completely paralyzed. The man who had walked into the courtroom expecting a swift, brutal coronation was now witnessing his own highly public execution. His wealthy country club friends, his influential church congregation, his entire elite social circle would soon know that the great Desmond Washington was a massive fraud. He had built his arrogant identity on a mountain of wealth that secretly belonged to the sister he despised, and now it belonged entirely to the daughter he had consistently humiliated and dismissed. "Your Honor." Brentwood pleaded, sweat actively beading on his forehead. "We respectfully request a brief recess to review these documents with our client." "Request denied." Judge Vance snapped her tone, leaving zero room for negotiation. The court is not finished. The defense has submitted a secondary file attached to this trust documentation. A file that aggressively moves this proceeding from a simple matter of probate and civil dispute directly into the realm of federal corporate fraud. Jamal violently jolted in his seat, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy wooden exit doors. The crushing realization of what he had done, of the massive digital trail he had recklessly left behind, suddenly hit him. He reached up and loosened his expensive silk tie, gasping for air as panic seized his throat. Kiara turned to her husband, her face twisted in confusion and dawning horror. Mr. Sterling stood smoothly, his posture radiating quiet victory. Your Honor, my client formally requests permission to address the court regarding the secondary file. Judge Vance nodded. Proceed. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the front of my slate gray blazer, maintaining perfect, unshakable posture. I did not look at Kiara, who was now quietly sobbing in genuine unscripted fear. I did not look at Patricia, whose face was buried deep in her trembling hands. I looked directly at the judge, maintaining the cold, analytical demeanor of a professional operating completely in her element. My father told this court I am a failure who counts pennies. I began, my voice ringing out clearly, echoing off the high mahogany walls with absolute authority. He is right. I am a corporate forensic auditor, and as the new chairman of the board of his company, I have spent the last 48 hours auditing my employees. I turned slowly, letting my gaze sweep past Brentwood and lock directly onto my father. His eyes were wide with naked terror. He finally recognized the apex predator standing in front of him. I bypassed the fraudulent, heavily manicured quarterly reports you presented to your country club friends, Desmond, I said, addressing him directly for the first time. I utilized my executive access to the offshore parent servers and pulled the raw, unedited ledgers. I found exactly what you and your chief financial officer have been desperately hiding. I shifted my gaze to Jamal. He flinched, physically shrinking away from me as if I held a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. Jamal created 3 phantom shell companies registered under vague consulting titles in neighboring states. I told the court, my tone clinical, detached, and utterly precise. Over the past 24 months, he systematically generated hundreds of fraudulent vendor invoices for fleet maintenance and security consulting that never actually occurred. He authorized nearly $2 million in corporate payments to these ghost entities. I have traced every single wire transfer. The stolen funds were routed through those shell accounts and deposited directly into offshore gambling syndicates and unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges. Jamal has entirely drained the corporate cash reserves to fund his private catastrophic addictions. A heavy collective gasp erupted from the gallery. Patricia let out a sharp, devastated cry, grabbing Desmond's arm, but Desmond could not even look at her. He was staring at Jamal with a look of pure, murderous rage, completely oblivious to his own impending destruction. Kiara stared at her husband in absolute disgust, realizing the perfect life she bragged about online was entirely funded by stolen money. But the forensic audit did not stop with simple embezzlement. I continued, turning my attention back to my father. I pulled the domestic tax filings. Desmond Washington, acting in his capacity as chief executive officer, personally signed and authorized every single fraudulent expense report Jamal submitted. He utilized these massive, fabricated business losses to illegally lower his corporate tax bracket. My father has committed aggressive, systematic federal tax evasion. He facilitated the theft of millions of dollars from a company he did not even own. Brentwood jumped to his feet, panic completely overtaking his polished, professional decorum. Objection, Your Honor. These are wild, highly unsubstantiated allegations. This is an unprovoked ambush. Sit down, Counselor Judge Vance barked, slamming her heavy wooden gavel once. The evidence submitted by the defense includes the exact routing numbers, the matching fraudulent invoices, the cryptocurrency wallet addresses, and your client's legally authorized signatures. It is highly substantiated and profoundly disturbing. I looked down at Desmond. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was entirely gone. In his place sat a broken, terrified old man facing the absolute undeniable ruin of his entire life, his carefully crafted reputation, and his personal freedom. "You tried to freeze my personal bank accounts," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper that carried clearly across the completely silent courtroom. "You tried to legally declare me insane. You tried to starve me out and force me to beg for your unearned mercy. You publicly humiliated me and attempted to destroy my professional reputation. You wanted a war, Desmond. Congratulations. You have one." I paused, letting the absolute weight of my words settle over my terrified family. "As the chairman of the Genesis Trust, I am formally terminating Desmond Washington and Jamal Davis, effective immediately. You are barred from entering any corporate property. Furthermore, I am handing this entire forensic dossier over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. You will both be facing decades in federal prison." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, broken only by a sharp, pathetic gasp from Jamal. The reality of federal prison hung over the plaintiff's table like an executioner's blade. Then, total chaos erupted. Kiara shrieked violently, shoving her husband away from her. Patricia began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. Judge Vance slammed her gavel repeatedly, her voice booming over the commotion, demanding immediate order in her courtroom. I remained standing, perfectly still, letting their manufactured panic turn into genuine unfiltered terror. But I was not finished taking down the golden boy. I reached back into Mr. Sterling's leather briefcase and retrieved a second thinner blue folder. I looked directly at Kiara. My sister was weeping, her meticulously crafted victim persona completely shattered by the reality of her husband's massive crimes. She thought the offshore gambling syndicates were the absolute worst of it. It was time to pull up the rest of the rotting roots. "Your Honor," I continued, my voice easily cutting through the remaining murmurs in the gallery. "The embezzlement did not just fund secret gambling addictions. The forensic audit uncovered a secondary, highly consistent stream of diverted corporate funds. Jamal Davis utilized a specific corporate vendor account falsely labeled as a regional logistics consulting firm to sign a multi-year lease on a luxury penthouse apartment in Midtown Atlanta." I pulled a glossy printed document from the blue folder, referencing a file named A1_13.docx. I handed the verified copy to the bailiff to pass up to the bench. "This is a copy of the lease agreement countersigned by Jamal Davis, under his corporate title," I stated clearly. "He authorized monthly wire transfers of exactly $8,000 directly from the company payroll to cover the rent, premium utilities, and a private gated parking space. He also utilized the corporate credit card detailed meticulously in a ledger saved as A2_13.docx to purchase over $40,000 in designer furniture, jewelry, and luxury apparel, all delivered directly to that specific Midtown address." Kiara stopped crying entirely. She stared at Jamal, her eyes wide with a horrifying, sickening realization. She slowly stood up from her chair. "And who resides at this corporate-funded apartment?" Miss Washington, Judge Vance asked, examining the lease agreement with a look of deep professional disgust. "A woman named Chloe Summers," I replied, not breaking eye contact with my brother-in-law. "A woman who is certainly not an employee or vendor of Washington Logistics. She is Jamal Davis's mistress." The courtroom exploded again, and this time Judge Vance let it happen for a few seconds. Kiara lunged at Jamal, striking his chest with her fists, screaming at him in front of the judge, the bailiff, and the crowded gallery. She shrieked about the late nights at the office, the supposed emergency weekend audits, and the business trips he claimed were absolutely necessary to keep the company afloat. Jamal tried to grab her hands, his face slick with sweat, begging her to calm down, frantically whispering that he could explain everything. There was no explanation. The numbers were absolute verified facts, and they were staring the entire family right in the face. My mother. Patricia reached out to grab Kiara, pulling her sobbing, hysterical daughter back into her chair. Patricia glared at me, her eyes burning with a hateful, desperate fury, silently blaming me for exposing the rot that she would have preferred to keep hidden behind closed doors. I felt absolutely zero pity for her. They had chosen to publicly attack my sanity to steal my hard-earned money. They were simply reaping the violent harvest of their own deceit. Jamal turned toward Judge Vance, his hands shaking violently. "Your Honor, please," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "This is a family dispute. This is a misunderstanding about executive compensation packages. I was approved for those funds as discretionary bonuses." Judge Vance did not even blink. Discretionary bonuses routed through offshore crypto exchanges and fraudulent shell companies to pay for a secret penthouse, Mr. Davis. She asked, her tone dripping with absolute judicial contempt. "Do not insult the intelligence of this court. You have brazenly utilized a corporate entity as your personal illegal piggy bank." Jamal collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The golden boy, the beloved son-in-law who was supposed to be the brilliant financial genius of the family, was completely broken. He had nothing left to say. His arrogant facade had been entirely dismantled by the undeniable truth of his own ledgers. But my father was not ready to surrender. Desmond Washington possessed an ego so massive, so incredibly resilient, that even faced with absolute corporate ruin, he believed he could talk his way out of it. He stood up violently, shrugging off Attorney Brentwood's desperate attempt to keep him seated. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at Jamal. "Your Honor, I had absolutely no idea," Desmond shouted, his voice echoing with righteous, desperate indignation. "I am a victim here. This boy, this criminal lied to me. He manipulated the books behind my back. He abused my trust and stole from my family. I am the chief executive officer. Yes, but I trusted my CFO to handle the daily ledgers. I never saw those specific wire transfers. I never authorized an apartment for a mistress. I was completely, entirely in the dark." Desmond turned to the judge, spreading his hands in a pathetic theatrical plea for sympathy. "You cannot hold me responsible for the secret, deceitful actions of a rogue employee. I am an honest businessman. I was betrayed by my own son-in-law." I smiled. It was the exact moment I had meticulously prepared for. It was the ultimate, inescapable legal double-bind. I picked up the original stack of emergency legal filings that Desmond's own lawyers had proudly served me with just 48 hours ago. I held up the thick document specifically citing the sworn affidavit saved in the court records as a 3_13.docx. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through Desmond's frantic, cowardly excuses. "I would like to direct the court's attention to the sworn affidavit filed by the plaintiff this very morning. This is the foundational document utilized to justify freezing my personal bank accounts and attempting to seize Vivian Washington's estate." Judge Vance looked down at the documents on her desk. "Yes, Miss Washington, proceed." I opened the file and read clearly from the highlighted paragraph. "In order to prove to this court that he was the only competent, responsible individual capable of managing Vivian's massive assets, my father made a very specific, legally binding claim under the strict penalty of federal perjury." I read his exact arrogant words directly into the record. "I, Desmond Washington, maintain absolute sole operational control and comprehensive daily oversight over every single financial transaction, vendor approval, and executive expenditure at Washington Logistics. No funds are dispersed without my explicit, direct, and reviewed authorization." I lowered the paper and looked directly at my father. The remaining blood completely rushed out of his face. He froze, his mouth hanging slightly open as the heavy steel jaws of the trap snapped completely shut around his neck. The absolute proof of his legal catch, 22, clearly outlined in my final forensic summary, named A4_13.docx, was undeniable. X. "You cannot have it both ways, Desmond," I stated coldly. "You swore a legal oath to this judge that you had absolute sole operational control and daily oversight of the finances. If that sworn statement is true, you are completely legally complicit in Jamal's massive embezzlement and federal tax fraud. You knowingly signed the fraudulent tax returns. You actively authorized the theft from your own subsidiary." I took a slow, deliberate step out from behind the defense table, letting the sheer weight of my words press down on him. But if you are now claiming you were completely in the dark, I continued, if you are telling this court you had absolutely no idea millions of dollars were being siphoned out of your accounts into offshore gambling syndicates in midtown penthouses, then you just committed blatant perjury. You lied under oath on a federal court filing in a malicious, calculated attempt to steal an estate and destroy my life. Desmond stared at me, his eyes wide with an animalistic, suffocating panic. He looked frantically at Brentwood, pleading silently for a legal lifeline. But his highly paid attorney was already packing his expensive briefcase, physically distancing himself from a client who had just confessed to either massive corporate fraud or felony perjury on the public record. Judge Vance folded her hands, leaning forward over the heavy wooden bench. She looked at Desmond with an expression of pure, concentrated authority. Miss Washington is entirely correct, Mr. Washington. Judge Vance said, her voice echoing with absolute, unforgiving finality. You have successfully trapped yourself in your own web of deceit. You filed a malicious, fabricated lawsuit in my courtroom to destroy a competent professional while actively overseeing a massive criminal enterprise. She picked up her wooden gavel, her eyes sweeping over the devastated, completely silent plaintiff's table. The emergency injunction against Zuri Washington is permanently dismissed, Judge Vance commanded. The petition for guardianship is denied with extreme prejudice. And as for you, Mr. Washington, and you, Mr. Davis, you are both ordered to remain seated in this courtroom. I am calling the federal authorities to take you into immediate custody pending a full, comprehensive criminal investigation based on the financial evidence presented here today. Judge Vance slammed the gavel down with a deafening crack. We are adjourned. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open, and the bailiffs firmly ushered my father and Jamal into the wide, marble-floored hallway. Kiara and my mother stumbled blindly behind them. Mr. Sterling and I followed at a measured, unhurried pace. I wanted to witness the absolute destruction of their carefully fabricated empire. I wanted to see the exact moment their toxic alliance shattered. The second the courtroom doors closed behind us, the illusion of the perfect, wealthy Washington family evaporated completely. They turned on each other like starved, cornered wolves. Kiara did not care about the federal authorities. She did not care about the massive corporate fraud or the fact that her father had just lost his entire logistics empire. Her mind was entirely consumed by the crushing, humiliating reality of the luxury penthouse in Midtown Atlanta. She lunged forward, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, and drove her open hand directly across Jamal's face. The slap echoed down the corridor like a gunshot. Jamal stumbled backward, his hands flying up to protect his face, but Kiara was absolutely relentless. You bought her a penthouse! Kiara screamed, her voice tearing at the seams, completely abandoning the polished, softly spoken socialite persona she had maintained for years. You stole millions of dollars from my family to buy a penthouse for some cheap mistress. You slept in my bed, you posed for our holiday cards, and you were funding a second life with my father's money. I gave up my entire career to play the perfect wife for you. Kiara swung at him again, her perfectly manicured nails catching his shoulder as he desperately tried to back away. Kiara, stop it, Jamal pleaded, his voice cracking with pure panic as he glanced nervously at the two bailiffs standing just feet away. You do not understand. I was stressed. The company was drowning in debt long before I got there. Your father was demanding impossible financial returns to keep up his lifestyle. I was just trying to find a way out. You found a way out into someone else's bed, Kiara shrieked, her face stained with ruined mascara and hot tears. You are a disgusting, pathetic fraud. You are going to prison, Jamal. And I am taking every single thing you have left. Jamal's fearful, pleading expression instantly morphed into a mask of ugly, desperate rage. The golden boy act was over. He realized Kiara was completely abandoning him to save herself, and he refused to go down alone. He turned his furious, bloodshot eyes toward Desmond, who was leaning heavily against the marble wall, looking sickly and frail. Do not, you dare put this all on me, Jamal snarled, pointing a trembling finger directly at my father's chest. You knew exactly what was happening. You knew the logistics business was failing. You hired me straight out of business school because you knew I was hungry and stupid enough to do your dirty work. You needed someone to falsify those vendor invoices so you could keep buying sports cars and country club memberships while the company bled out. Keep your voice down, you absolute idiot, Desmond hissed, his eyes darting frantically toward the armed officers. You are confessing to a federal crime in front of law enforcement. I am already going to prison because of your arrogant stupidity, Jamal shouted, completely unhinged. You thought you were untouchable. You thought you could just sue Zuri and bully her into handing over Vivian's estate. You told me this lawsuit was a guaranteed win. You told me Zuri was weak and would fold the second we froze her bank accounts. Instead, you handed her the keys to the entire kingdom and she audited us into oblivion. Jamal stepped closer to my father, his chest heaving with terrified, furious breaths. You used me! Desmond Jamal roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings of the courthouse corridor. You gave me the chief financial officer title so your hands would look clean. You made me the authorized signer on those shell accounts because you needed a scapegoat. You trapped me in this family so you could blame me when the federal agents finally came knocking. You are a coward. And I am telling the district attorney every single thing you ordered me to do. Desmond physically recoiled, looking frantically at Kiara and Patricia for support, but he found absolutely none. His own son-in-law had just guaranteed his lengthy prison sentence. The powerful patriarch was entirely isolated, stripped of his stolen authority, his fabricated wealth, and his loyal accomplices. The wolves had devoured each other in less than 5 minutes. I stood silently next to Mr. Sterling, watching the spectacular implosion. There was no joy in it, only a cold, clinical satisfaction. I had surgically removed a malignant cancer from my life and Vivian's legacy. As the reality of total financial and social ruin finally set in, the dynamic in the hallway shifted again. My mother Patricia had remained unusually quiet during Kiara and Jamal's explosive confrontation. She was staring at her designer handbag, then at the marble floor, her mind desperately trying to calculate a way out of the wreckage. Patricia Washington was a woman who defined her entire existence by her social standing. She lived for the exclusive charity galas, the elite country club brunches, and the luxurious, carefree lifestyle funded by Desmond's corporate accounts. The Genesis Trust documents had just legally confirmed that she owned absolutely nothing. Her cars, her jewelry, and her massive suburban estate were all tied to a company that now belonged exclusively to me. And her husband was about to be indicted by the district attorney. I watched the exact moment her denial shattered. The cold, haughty arrogance she had worn like a protective armor completely dissolved, replaced by a raw, unvarnished panic. She looked up and saw me standing calmly by the courtroom doors. Suddenly, her entire demeanor changed. The woman who had glared at me with cold, unforgiving judgment just 20 minutes prior morphed into a portrait of desperate maternal agony. She practically shoved past a weeping Kiara and a furious Jamal rushing directly toward me. Zuri Patricia cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. Real tears, thick and heavy, began spilling over her carefully applied makeup. She reached out her hands, shaking as she tried to grasp my arms. I took a sharp, deliberate step backward. Mr. Sterling subtly shifted his weight, placing himself slightly between me and my mother's frantic approach, a silent, professional barrier against her manipulation. Zuri, my baby. Patricia sobbed, her voice echoing with a desperate, cloying sweetness that made my stomach turn. Please, you have to stop this. This has gone too far. We are family. You are my daughter. You cannot let them take your father away. You have to save your father. I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The word family sounded utterly repulsive coming from her mouth. You have to tell the district attorney it was a mistake, Patricia pleaded, clasping her hands together in a theatrical display of begging. Tell them Jamal acted alone. Tell them Desmond was just confused. You control the company now. You can drop the charges. You can make this all go away. We can go back to being a family. I will make sure he treats you with the respect you deserve. I promise. Zuri, just please do not take our home. Do not let them put him in a cell. I looked at the tears streaming down her face. A decade ago, seeing my mother cry would have broken my heart. I would have instantly folded, apologizing for things I never did, sacrificing my own peace of mind, just to secure a fleeting, conditional moment of her affection. I would have handed over every single asset just to hear her call me her baby and mean it. But I was no longer the desperate seeking child she had constantly belittled. I was the corporate forensic auditor who had just dismantled her entire fraudulent existence. Save my father, I repeated, my voice flat, carrying the cold, hard edge of a diamond blade. You are asking me to save a man who just stood in front of a federal judge and swore under oath that I was mentally unstable. A man who tried to legally steal my inheritance, freeze my bank accounts, and render me completely homeless. Patricia flinched, but she kept crying, reaching out her hands again. He was just angry, Zuri. He did not mean it. You know how he gets. He is a proud man. He is a criminal, Mom, I corrected her sharply. And he did not make a simple mistake. He committed systematic, calculated fraud for years. He stole millions of dollars from Vivian. He allowed Jamal to drain the corporate reserves to buy a penthouse for his mistress. And you looked the other way because it funded your country club memberships and your luxury vacations. No, Zuri. I did not know, Patricia stammered, her eyes wide with panic. I swear to you, I had no idea about the money or the mistress. It does not matter what you knew, I said, cutting off her desperate excuses. What matters is what you did when he decided to destroy me. You sat in that courtroom and watched him try to ruin my life. You nodded along while his lawyer called me a failure. You smiled when they talked about locking me away in a guardianship. You were perfectly happy to watch me burn as long as you got to keep your credit cards. Patricia let out a loud, breathless sob, finally realizing her maternal manipulation was completely ineffective. But we are your family, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her impending poverty. Vivian was my family, I replied, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or mercy. Vivian saw exactly who you all were. That is why she built the Genesis Trust. That is why she made sure Desmond never owned a single share of Washington Logistics. She knew he would eventually destroy it, and she made sure I had the power to stop him. I looked past my weeping mother, locking eyes with my father, who was now being officially detained by the federal authorities who had just arrived at the end of the corridor. Two agents in dark suits were speaking to the bailiffs, flashing their badges, and moving directly toward Desmond and Jamal. I cannot save him, Mom, I said, turning my attention back to her terrified face. And even if I could, I would not. I am not the daughter you can manipulate anymore. I am the chairman of the board, and my first official act is cleaning up the mess you all created. I turned my back on her tears, her pleas, and the absolute ruin of the Washington family. I walked down the marble hallway with Mr. Sterling, the sound of handcuffs clicking closed echoing behind me. Wait. The frantic, shrill voice echoed sharply off the high ceilings of the courthouse corridor. The frantic clatter of expensive heels striking the polished stone floor grew louder, faster, and more desperate. Before I could take another step toward the exit, Patricia lunged forward. Her heavily ringed fingers wrapped tightly around my forearm, gripping my slate-gray blazer with a fierce, suffocating intensity. It was not the touch of a loving mother seeking comfort. It was the terrifying sinking grip of a drowning woman desperately grasping at the only viable piece of floating wreckage she could find. I stopped walking. Mr. Sterling paused instantly beside me, his posture shifting into a subtle protective stance, but I raised a single hand to signal that I had the situation completely under control. I did not pull away immediately. I stood perfectly still and turned my head to look at the woman who had given birth to me. Patricia was entirely unrecognizable. The immaculate, untouchable matriarch of the Washington family had completely disintegrated. Her perfectly coiffed hair was disheveled. Dark, heavy streaks of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her pale, panicked face. Her chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. She was hyperventilating, staring at me with wide, bloodshot eyes that pleaded for a salvation she absolutely did not deserve. "Zuri, please!" Patricia choked out, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her collapsing reality. "You cannot just walk away. I am your mother. I carried you. I raised you. You cannot destroy our family like this. We can fix this. I will make Desmond apologize to you. I will make him give you whatever position you want in the company. Just please do not leave me with nothing. You have to protect us." I looked down at her manicured hand. her fingers digging desperately into my sleeve. For 32 years, I had craved her validation. I had spent my entire childhood and the vast majority of my adult life contorting myself into impossible shapes, hoping to earn just a fraction of the warmth and fierce loyalty she so effortlessly bestowed upon Kiara and Jamal. I had agonized over her casual dismissals, her cutting remarks about my career, and her silent complicity every single time my father sought to humiliate me. But standing there in the cold courthouse hallway, looking into her terrified, calculating eyes, I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, aching void in my chest that had always yearned for a mother's love was completely gone. In its place was a solid, impenetrable core of absolute clarity. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or match her frantic, hysterical energy. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I reached down and placed my hand over hers. I could feel her pulse racing, her skin clammy with cold sweat. Gently but firmly, with an unstoppable mechanical strength, I pried her fingers off my arm, breaking her physical hold on me forever. I let her hand drop to her side. She stared at me, her mouth trembling in profound shock. "Failures do not belong in this family, remember," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of emotion. Patricia flinched violently, as if I had physically struck her across the face. She recognized her own toxic words instantly. It was the exact phrase she had used to dismiss me when I chose forensic auditing over the flashy, superficial corporate titles my father offered. It was the phrase she had whispered to her country club friends to explain away my absence at their lavish, stolen gatherings. "You all made your choices when you tried to leave me on the street." I continued maintaining unwavering eye contact, forcing her to absorb the absolute finality of her own actions. "You watched Desmond file that injunction. You helped him pick out his suit this morning. You sat in that courtroom fully expecting to watch me be stripped of my sanity, my assets, and my dignity. You did not care if I was ruined, Mom. You only care now because the fire you helped start has burned down your own house. Now you can live with the consequences." Patricia let out a shattered, breathy sob, stepping backward as the absolute truth of my words slammed into her. She raised a hand to her mouth, shaking her head in denial, but she did not attempt to touch me again. The psychological severance was complete. She finally understood that the daughter she had deemed entirely worthless was now the absolute architect of her ruin. I turned away from her, my expression hardening back into the lethal, focused demeanor of a corporate executive. I looked toward the end of the corridor. The two federal agents were currently patting down Desmond and Jamal, emptying their pockets and reading them their rights. Kiara was standing a few feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso, staring at her handcuffed husband in a state of catatonic shock. "Mr. Sterling," I said, softly extending my hand without looking at him. "The termination packets, please." My attorney opened his pristine leather briefcase and produced two thick, heavy envelopes stamped with the official corporate seal of the Genesis Trust. I took them, feeling the satisfying weight of the high-grade watermarked paper. I walked directly toward the federal agents. The sound of my heels against the marble floor echoed with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. "Excuse me, gentlemen," I said, addressing the two agents politely. "As the chairman of the board for the Genesis Trust and the legal owner of Washington Logistics, I have an administrative obligation to execute before you transport these individuals to a federal holding facility." The older agent nodded, stepping back slightly, but keeping a firm grip on Desmond's bicep. "Go right ahead, ma'am." Desmond stared at me. His expensive tailored suit suddenly looked far too large for his shrinking, defeated frame. His eyes, usually filled with arrogant fire and unyielding dominance, were completely hollow. He looked like a man who had already died but had not yet received the official autopsy report. Jamal stood next to him, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic tears. I held up the first envelope and tucked it sharply into the front breast pocket of my father's suit jacket. I took the second envelope and slid it into the pocket of Jamal's blazer. "These are your formal, legally binding notices of termination for cause," I stated, ensuring my voice carried clearly to Patricia and Kiara, who were watching in paralyzed horror from down the hall. "Effective exactly as of the ruling inside that courtroom, you are both permanently severed from all corporate entities operating under the Genesis Trust. Your employment is terminated. Your executive privileges are entirely revoked. You are entitled to zero severance pay, zero stock options, and absolutely zero corporate benefits. Desmond swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Zuri, please. He rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel. The humiliation is enough. You have won. Let it go. I am just getting started, Desmond, I replied, a razor-sharp edge slicing through my professional tone. As a consequence of your immediate termination for gross financial misconduct and federal fraud, the Genesis Trust is currently executing a total asset reclamation protocol. I turned slightly, ensuring I was addressing the entire ruined family. Every single corporate credit card currently resting in your designer wallets was deactivated precisely 10 minutes ago, I informed them, watching the realization dawn on Kiara's tear-stained face. The Black American Express cards you use to fund your extravagant dinners, your luxury spa days, and your offshore vacations are entirely useless. They will decline at any terminal you attempt to use. Kiara gasped, her hands flying to her designer purse, panic overriding her shock. Zuri? Wait, she stammered, stepping forward. My cards are in there. My accounts are tied to the company. Your accounts are tied to stolen funds. Kiara, I corrected her sharply. And the reclamation does not stop at plastic. I looked directly at my sister, delivering the final, crushing logistical blow. The fleet of luxury vehicles you all enjoy so immensely are registered directly to Washington Logistics as corporate assets, I stated. That includes the black SUV Desmond drove to the courthouse this morning. And it specifically includes the brand new Mercedes-Benz you drove here, Kiara. Kiara's jaw dropped. No, she whispered, shaking her head in frantic denial. No, that is my car. Jamal bought me that car for my birthday. Jamal leased that car using a corporate vendor account he was simultaneously using to fund his mistress, I replied, watching her face shatter all over again. I dispatched a specialized corporate recovery team 45 minutes ago. They are currently in the courthouse parking garage with tow trucks and the verified legal titles. Your vehicles are being repossessed immediately. You have absolutely no legal right to access them. Desmond let out a low, agonizing groan, his chin dropping to his chest. The absolute totality of his defeat was finally crushing the last remaining breath out of his lungs. He was going to a federal holding cell, and his wife and daughter were stranded in a courthouse with absolutely nothing. If you try to access those vehicles, I added, my tone turning dangerously cold, the recovery team has strict instructions to have you arrested for attempted grand theft auto. I took a slow, deliberate step back, surveying the complete and utter devastation I had orchestrated. The untouchable Washington family was entirely dismantled. Their wealth was frozen. Their status was vaporized. Their patriarch and their golden son-in-law were wearing federal handcuffs. And the women who had spent their entire lives mocking my independence were now entirely dependent on a reality they could no longer afford. You came here today fully intending to leave me homeless and useless, I said, echoing the exact toxic threat my father had weaponized against me for decades. But the Genesis Trust strictly protects its assets. You have no money, you have no cars, you have no power. I offered them one final icy smile. I highly suggest you call a cab to get home, I advised them smoothly, assuming you have enough cash in your pockets to pay the fare. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the weeping women and the handcuffed men. I walked confidently down the long marble corridor with Mr. Sterling by my side. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, stepping out into the bright, blinding sunlight, leaving the ashes of their fraudulent empire completely behind me. 6 months passed with the swift, unforgiving momentum of a corporate takeover. The absolute destruction of Desmond Washington was a highly publicized, spectacular event. Once the federal authorities began digging into the forensic dossier, I provided the rotting foundation of his carefully projected empire collapsed entirely. His beloved mansion, a massive property he had leveraged against phantom corporate assets, was seized by the bank within 60 days. He was publicly expelled from his elite country club, a social humiliation that ultimately shattered his fragile, arrogant ego far more thoroughly than any legal penalty ever could. The man who had demanded total submission from everyone around him now spent his days sitting in a cramped rental apartment completely isolated, drafting desperate legal appeals that no respectable attorney would ever agree to touch. He is a ghost of his former self, entirely consumed by the bitter reality of his own actions. Jamal fared significantly worse. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not take kindly to his offshore gambling syndicates or his luxury penthouse schemes. He is currently facing a massive federal indictment for multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate embezzlement. The slick, confident chief financial officer who had sneered at me across the mahogany boardroom table is now looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. His mistress unsurprisingly abandoned the midtown apartment the exact second the corporate funds stopped flowing, leaving him to face the devastating reality of his addictions entirely alone while awaiting trial on a restricted ankle monitor. Kiara's pristine, heavily filtered online life evaporated the moment her luxury vehicles were repossessed. Stripped of her stolen wealth and the glamorous status she used to mask her profound insecurities, she was forced to face the real world. She is currently working a minimum wage retail job at a suburban shopping mall, spending 8 hours a day folding sweaters and dealing with difficult customers. It is a harsh descent from the country club brunches and exclusive charity galas she used to attend. She spends her breaks aggressively posting long, bitter complaints on her social media channels, desperately trying to paint herself as the tragic victim of a cruel, vindictive sister. But the internet is famously fickle. Her audience no longer entertained by her designer handbag hauls or luxury vacation vlogs simply scrolled past her complaints. She is shouting into an absolute void, entirely ignored by the elite circles she once desperately worshipped. My mother, Patricia, experienced the exact fate she had always terrified herself with. Completely cut off from the Genesis Trust and the corporate accounts she treated as her personal piggy bank, she was forced to drastically downsize. She now lives in a remarkably small, heavily mortgaged condo on the outskirts of the city. The lavish charity events and high society socialite circles have entirely shut her out. Without the massive wealth to insulate her abrasive personality, her former friends simply stopped returning her calls. She occasionally leaves me tearful, highly manipulative voicemails, begging for reconciliation, attempting to leverage a maternal bond she had thoroughly destroyed years ago. I simply forward them to Mr. Sterling to file away. There is zero contact, zero financial support, and zero mercy. Back at Washington Logistics, the corporate restructuring was swift, brutal, and entirely necessary. I completely gutted the corrupt C-suite my father had installed. I fired the complacent executives who had looked the other way, while Jamal drained the accounts, ensuring every enabler was permanently removed from the premises. In their place, I recruited a brilliant, diverse team of competent leaders who actually understood operational integrity. Under my direct supervision as chairman of the board, the company not only recovered from the embezzlement, but achieved record-breaking profits in our very first quarter. We stabilized the vendor contracts, overhauled the accounting department, and established a thriving corporate culture built on absolute transparency and mutual respect. But my proudest achievement had nothing to do with freight lines or logistics. Aunt Vivian had left me her estate because she recognized my strength, but she also wanted me to build something entirely my own. After careful consideration, I decided to sell her sprawling, beautiful house. I took the massive capital from that sale and used it to launch the Vivian Genesis Foundation. It is a highly specialized, fully funded incubator designed specifically to support and invest in young Black women entering the challenging fields of finance, technology, and corporate auditing. I am actively providing them with the exact mentorship resources and unyielding support my own family had aggressively tried to deny me. I am honoring her true legacy by ensuring the next generation of brilliant women never have to fight for a seat at a table that was built to exclude them. Instead, we are giving them the capital and the confidence to construct their own empires from the ground up. I currently stand in my immaculate corner office, the wide floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular, unobstructed view of the gleaming Atlanta skyline. I take a slow, satisfying sip of my chamomile tea, feeling the warm ceramic of the mug against my palms as the morning sunlight floods the room. The frantic, toxic noise of my past is completely silent, replaced by the steady, productive hum of a successful enterprise. I am surrounded by the thriving, legitimate empire I salvaged and the bright, undeniable future I am actively creating. The air in my office is clean, quiet, and perfectly peaceful. Sometimes inheriting a legacy means you have to be willing to burn the old one to the ground. Family isn't about blood, it's about who respects your worth. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace and your empire? Drop your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.